Morning. I am Jane Hauser. I'm the Director of Marketing and Outreach for NESCA. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am joined by Kelley Challen, who is the Director of Transition Services here at NESCA. And just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. Just to let you know, if you do have questions throughout, if you want to just type those in the chat function, that would be great, or the Q&A area. And we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session. And thank you again for joining us, and I will turn that over to Kelley Challen.
Good morning. I'm Kelley Challen, and as Jane mentioned, I oversee transition services here at NESCA, and I've been here 9 years, and I had the privilege of overseeing our consultation and planning and assessment services. And we also have a very robust coaching program for middle school, high school, and young adult clients. If you're unfamiliar with NESCA, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about our practice. NESCA stands for Neuropsychology and Education Services for Children and Adolescents. We're a group practice with offices in Newton and Plainville, Massachusetts, as well as Londonderry, New Hampshire. And we specialize in assessment, treatment, and consultation services for children, adolescents, and young adults with special needs, whether mild or complex. Our clinical staff is comprised of 11 expert neuropsychologists and 5 transition specialists. Our transition specialists have a mix of backgrounds in school and guidance counseling, occupational therapy, and vocational rehab counseling. We also have therapists and psychoeducational counselors on staff, and treatment providers, including occupational therapists and speech language pathologists and consultants. NESCA was founded in 2007 as a neuropsychology practice, but we've had transition specialists on staff and offered transition services since 2009, essentially since the beginning of the practice. And this means that thinking about transition planning is really ingrained into our practice, and each of our clinicians aims to provide thorough and accurate testing that can support a family and team in creating a roadmap for helping a child progress toward adult life. So that's a lot of information about NESCA and us. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute to just type into the chat and let me know if you're a parent or a professional, and how old your child is, or how old sort of the children you work with tend to be. That can sometimes help me to know sort of who's in the audience. So I'll keep going, but I would love it if you just take a little time to chat that into me. Thank you. And just with our first couple responses, we have a broad audience ranging from sort of middle school through sort of post 12th grade age, which is great. And I'm going to do my best to make the content relevant for everyone. You know, feel free to ask age-specific kinds of questions toward the end if those things come up. So today we're really going to go through some definitions of transition, touch upon why transition planning should begin early, although I will say it is never too late to focus on transition planning if you're coming in a little bit later. And then we'll spend most of our time discussing the skills and factors that make the biggest difference in successful transition planning, in post-secondary satisfaction and success for our children. And I'm hoping to leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. And it's really helpful if you keep the questions in the Q&A, and then other sort of comments in the chat. This is great. So transition is certainly a word that we hear a lot about, but what does it mean? We could look at Merriam-Webster and think about these definitions just sort of changing from one state or place to another, moving or developing from one stage to another style or stage. We could consider this definition, which comes from Andrew Halpern, and really says that transition refers to a change in status from behaving primarily as a student to assuming emergent adult roles in the community. Something we know about young adulthood, just from research and from sort of cultural observations, is that this sort of taking on adult roles is something that happens over time, right? Typical young adults are spending much longer period of time living at home than they did historically, or at least historically in the last 30 years. And so sort of what these adult roles look like changes in the community. And we need to think about that for our students, sort of what adult roles they're going to be taking on and during what time periods. And then for students on IEPs, transition has additional implications, right? Transition services are a legal term and a concept defined in federal law. And so certainly we transition plan for all young people, but we have legal transition planning obligations for students on IEPs. IDEA 2004, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act from 2004, is the law that governs special education services in the United States. And this law requires that no later than age 16 in the country, 14 in Massachusetts, a student's IEP has to include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals. So those are post-high school goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate independent living skills. And the IEP has to have transition services described in it, including courses of study, so including what kinds of coursework the student's going to do. And it describes the transition services that are going to be needed to assist the child in reaching their post-high school goals. Transition services are defined in the law and the regs, and it's a coordinated set of activities. So it needs to be activities that are being coordinated, not just happening independent of one another, and needs to be designed to be within a results-oriented process. It's focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability, and it's going to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, which can include post-secondary ed, vocational education, integrated employment, right? Competitive employment, even if that includes supports, continuing and adult education, adult services, independent living, and community participation. The law says or community participation. In Massachusetts, community participation is a requirement. Transition services are based on this individual student's needs. They take into account their strengths, preferences, and interests, and they include things like instruction, direct instruction, related services, but also community experiences, development of employment and post-school adult living objectives. And for many students, they can include acquisition of daily living skills and also functional vocational evaluations when needed. It's funny because this says transition services simplified, but obviously it's a complex graphic. But really the 4 words we focus on are the student's strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. We have expectations for the student to participate in transition planning and services, that transition assessment will be part of the process. Currently in Massachusetts, that the transition planning form will be used, and that our process is going to be focused on measurable post-secondary, post-high school goals, things that happen after high school. There's 4 areas that we focus on when we are transitioning students. We focus on education that's going to happen after high school, employment that's going to happen, independent living, and community involvement. And there are 4 really important concepts. It's a vision-driven process. It's focused on expectations, goals, hopes for the future. It's results-oriented. We need to be moving forward and aiming toward. It's a coordinated process, and it's both academic and functional. IEP transition planning is a little bit of a cyclical process. It's how we engage the student and empower the student, throughout their IEP process and then even beyond. Certainly goal setting or visioning is how we identify and write goals, and goal setting should always be informed by some type of assessment, just like anything else in the IEP process. Once we have goals, we create an action plan for progressing towards those goals. We come up with steps we're going to take over time, both long-term and short-term and annual kinds of steps. We execute our plan, and then we evaluate progress and adjust the plan or the goal. And then we do it all over again, right? We're transition planning over the course of the year, the same way we're doing all sorts of other planning on an annual basis. Transition planning is also a mindset. and it goes way beyond the IEP. And as a parent, it's hard to be thinking about this all the time. As a professional working with students, it's hard to be thinking about this all the time. You know, when you're professional, you're a helper. When you're a parent, you want to ease the way, right? But it's a mindset, and it's something we need to be thinking about. And it's really requires sort of durable thinking and being optimistic and being creative and flexible. Certainly we move slowly and we take opportunities one at a time. We often take the opportunities in an unexpected order. Something might present itself that hadn't presented itself previously. And so, you know, that's the appropriate opportunity to be moving forward. It really is a marathon. I can't emphasize enough that self-care, you know, for us is important. Self-care for the student is important. You know, it's hard work. I think going, you know, through the process of being someone who is heavily accommodated to being an adult who is able to seek the accommodations you need and to be successful in a whole bunch of settings that you've never been in before. And you really do need a village. And I will talk more about building a team toward the end of this presentation. So I have great news for anybody on this presentation, whether student is 11 or 8 or 20, everyone has started transition planning. You know, it's something that really does start at birth. And every time we make a conscious decision to teach a young person a skill, that is transition planning, no matter how small or big that skill is. Also, when we're lucky, times that students assert themselves that they want to do something on their own, and we allow them to sort of move forward and progress and do something on their own, even if they fail and then, you know, try again. That's all transition planning, right? I'm a parent of 5 and 9-year-old boys, and it's definitely a struggle to get them to build independence with life skills and chores, and it takes time. But I try to think of, you know, things I can do in the moment, or also like one thing I could be focused on each week or each month to be building up self-care and domestic activities at home or community skills when we're out. I've recently been very excited because my local Trader Joe's has, you know, smaller shopping carts. And so we can work on all sorts of things like negotiating a shopping cart around other people, right? What do you do if you bump the shopping cart into other people? How do you find what you want on the shelf? What if they changed which shelf it's on in the store and we need to go ask for help? As you can imagine, there's sort of an infinite list of skills you can work on in any situation. And so you pick and choose and you sort of focus on, you know, if you're an educator, focusing on what we've sort of opted to put in the IEP for this year, but also the teachable moments that come up. And as parents, you know, I think a lot of times it's just focusing on whatever your kid's willing to be focused on at those moments, you know, wherever you can get the buy-in, and just knowing that there's sort of a list, whether it's in the back of your mind or a tangible list of things that we are working on to progress students towards independence. Why is it important to begin early? There are lots of reasons to think about beginning transition planning early. Certainly, if we want to see a smooth transition from high school to post-high school young adult life, we need to be putting pieces in place to do that. And this process does take a while, right? And including key stakeholders who are going to be part of our kids' lives post-high school means we have to learn who those people are. We have to get them involved. We have to make sure they know who our kids are. And so it just takes a while to do this kind of planning. Also, learning takes longer with disabilities, and there are often fewer opportunities for students with special needs to be learning adulting skills, right? Their time may be taken up by other kinds of services, or they may not be given the same opportunities. And so this learning can take longer. We need to prioritize one skill at a time. We need to practice skills many, many times across settings and contexts. We can't take things for granted. We have to understand that explicit instruction is often a really critical piece of this process. Certainly we have to repeat things enough that they become automatic, you know, achieving automaticity. So transitioning from school, which you've been doing forever and is relatively the same, even though there can be some big jumps to middle school and high school, when we're thinking about transitioning outside of being a student, that's stressful. It's creates anxiety. It's new. And so if we can reduce kind of basic skill development needs, if I know how to get myself breakfast, even if it's cold cereal, if I know how to do my laundry, then it's a little bit less stressful as I take on, say, new learning in a different environment or new work experiences. Also, and I did mention, students need more explicit instruction, and that takes time. And we do want to try to set the tone and mindset and the sort of growth mindset and positive, optimistic, moving forward mindset before adolescence if we can. I know we're pretty close to that, if not already there for a lot of people on this call, but it takes a while to shift, to shift who's in the driver's seat for the student, and to make sure that the student is comfortable with that and that we feel comfortable with that. Also, financial and legal planning takes time too. Planning for housing takes a lot of time, and it can still take a lot of time in young adulthood. So being aware of some of these changes, learning about these processes is important. And it can be overwhelming to think about some of this starting early, but earlier is certainly positive. Why else is transition planning important? We've done a couple of national longitudinal studies on students, taking data on students who've transitioned from IEPs to adulthood, sort of over 10-year process. And we know that youth who are on IEPs, are less likely during high school to take a college placement exam, take a high school course and get college credit for that, have any sort of paid work experience during high school, or even be expected to attend college or live on their own. So we know we're sort of setting lower expectations for some of our youth. And then we know from the post-secondary outcomes that a lot of young adults with disabilities are actually more likely to attend two-year colleges, but less likely to complete four-year college programs. They will earn on average $1 less per hour. They're less likely to live independently, and also less likely to be engaging in financial independence activities, like having a checking account or a credit card. And again, this is just looking at students over 10 years. So we're sort of still talking about young adults who are below the age of 30. In this study, some of these things may take longer than the age of 30, but essentially our outcomes are quite different for our students on IEPs and our students who are not on IEPs. And we do know that over 76% of adults with developmental disabilities, which is a population of our students with disabilities, are living at home with their families, right? It's a very small percentage of adults that have residential supports. And nationwide, at least 25% of caregivers for adults with disabilities are age 60 or older, right? We have, we're not seeing the levels of independence that I think a lot of us envision for students early on. If you have a loved one with autism or a student with autism, something to note is that individuals with autism are one of the 5 disability groups most likely to make an unsuccessful transition, to not experience satisfaction as they're making the transition. And also adults with autism are more likely to be unemployed and underemployed in comparison to any other disability category. So we really need to focus for all of our students, but we need to be aware that outcomes are complicated. So I've told you why we need to focus on transition planning. If we're going to focus, and put time and energy into helping young people build skills, what are the skills that are the most important? These are 6 skills that have been repeatedly highlighted as impactful for success and satisfaction in adulthood from various forms of research. And there's additional research that just continues to come out that my colleague across the hall is always sending me on this self-determination skill. But the skills that make a difference are things like self-awareness, goal setting, perseverance, use of available resources, emotional coping strategies, and self-determination, which sort of encompasses many of these other skills. And these are the variables that we see time and time again are really evidence-based predictors of, again, success, right? Success being things like having a job or being able to participate in learning, or just ratings of sort of happiness, number of friends, quality of life. So for self-awareness, students, I'm going to focus first on just saying students do have to be able to report accurate information regarding their disabilities and to express types of accommodations that they need for success in various settings, and to explain the special education services that they've been receiving to other people. We cannot be doing the special education process for our kids. They have to be active participants in this process. They need to be able to be their own voices in whatever way they communicate in post-secondary adult life. And so part of the self-awareness is the disability awareness piece. But there's also the sort of broader needing to be aware of strengths and limitations and using self-awareness to guide decision-making. So certainly at NESCA, we conduct a high number of transition assessments. And something that's not uncommon for students, any age, middle school, high school, post-high school, coming in, is that they might actually be aware of some of their strengths and challenges, but they might have a learning goal or a career interest goal or sort of stated career goal that doesn't fully align with their strengths and challenges. A critical piece of planning for adulthood is helping students to learn how their strengths and challenges and how their preferences, connect with the goals that they're setting for themselves. And that's not the same thing as just telling a young person that their goals are unrealistic. It's much more of a showing process, of a trying process, of a shadowing jobs and recognizing for yourself, what kinds of things may work or not work about that job. So certainly there's a lot that we do to develop self-awareness. What's great about developing self-awareness is that there are lots of different starting points for students to be doing self-exploration, right? Some students, the best place to start is what do you not like? What do you hate? What do you not want, right? Sometimes that's easier for a student to identify than the things that they really like or enjoy. And sometimes that is part of transition planning is we eliminate the stuff you hate, and maybe we start to put you in situations with the things that you can tolerate. And that's how we figure out, some of the social activities or vocational activities that are going to be a fit. But also learning things that you do well, things that you can learn more easily. We talk a lot in my household about that, everyone has something they can learn just slightly easier, and that's not necessarily disability related, right? But being able to talk about those differences, that people have different strengths, different things that they're able to just learn slightly more easily. And therefore they might be a little more good at or a little more competent at, but also not discouraging learning for some of the things that are challenging, but being aware of what's harder to learn and aware of what you might need to learn something that's hard more easily. Things that make you feel proud. A question that I often ask students is, tell me about a time, it can be a recent time, or you can think all the way back to kindergarten or preschool, but a time that you felt proud, a time you felt good, a time you felt like you accomplished something. Those moments are so important. I mean, think about, you have to be able to name things like that in job interviews. You have to be able to name things like that in, college application process. But it's also just important to know what made you feel good so that you can replicate that moving forward. And certainly understanding a little bit about your personality and how you connect with other people. Or, who are people that are helpful to you? What are supports that are helpful to you? You don't have to do all of these things to begin developing self-awareness. You could sort of pick and choose a starting point that's going to be the best fit for the student. In terms of thinking about self-awareness and disability and disclosure, disclosure is a really important aspect of self-awareness, and it's not something that's just like a one-time thing, whether it's the student learning about themselves or the student sharing information with other people, right? So there is no magic age. Each student's development and readiness to learn will be different, and sort of what they can grapple with will be different at different stages. It's not always about disclosing a diagnostic label. It could be, descriptive information about a young person, right? For instance, one of my children has dyslexia, and so we're not using the label dyslexia, but we're talking about that, sometimes his brain does funny things with the words that he's trying to read, right? And talking about some of the strategies he has to use. And we talk about that as a family. One of my kids, his brain doesn't do those funny things. The other one, it does. So really thinking about how to describe what's going on, because the truth is, as an adult, when you disclose information to another person, it's far more important to be, it's important to be able to diagnose, to disclose labels. You have to use those to be able to seek accommodations, but it's also really critical to be able to explain what your disability is doing for you, sort of how it's impacting you, how it's impacting your access, and what can be helpful for that. So the descriptive info is such a really critical piece of disclosure. And recognizing impact and not trying to minimize when something's really, really hard and it's a bummer, or it's really, really hard and it's great because you've been able to sort of persevere through that. Disclosure is a process, right? Learning and growing and changing. We have so many fantastic resources these days. It's important to make sure that we're looking at accurate resources, because certainly TV and movie depictions can be realistic or really far-fetched. But there are some great resources. And it's also, being able to understand, brains, and every single human brain is different, and how different pieces of the brain function. And then also it's really important to be honest and ask other people to give honest feedback. It is not fair to tell someone that they're really great at something they're not actually so great at, right? So there's a difference between saying that, your performance was a really successful performance for you compared to other performances versus like the best performance in the whole school or something like that. And we want to be accurate when we're giving compliments and praise. I just point out there's this 411 Disability Disclosure Handbook. It's a great resource to look up, and it has guidance for parents and professionals for working with students around disclosure. This is just another slide with some other information about things that can be important when thinking about self-awareness and disability, learning styles and multiple intelligences, interpersonal styles and organizational styles, right? These are sort of all the impact and function, comparing strengths and challenges to known people or family members or TV or book characters. Again, using how things are divided at home to highlight strengths and challenges. And certainly I'm a huge proponent of students being involved in feedback discussions with their psychologist or counselor or special ed teacher or reading specialist about any testing process that they've been through, really as young as the clinician feels competent to be able to give that information to the child. We do feedback sessions with students who have neuropsychological evaluations at NESCA. Anytime it's requested, pro bono. A lot of times we may push it too, but if you have a younger child you think would benefit from sitting with a psychologist to hear a little bit about their brain, or see a little graph, clinicians are able to share that information in developmentally appropriate ways, and that's a really important aspect of going through an evaluation process, is figuring out like what was learned from being tested. And we certainly do that with students who've had transition assessments here. I like to do the feedback session with them right before they go to their IEP meeting, so that they have a very good sense of what they're going to hear and what kinds of recommendations are going to be made, and why that's happening, and again, they worked hard in a testing process, and they should have an understanding of what's been learned through that. So I think that feedback is so critical. Goal setting is also important in addition to self-awareness, right? Being able to name specific realistic goals and conceive of a way to measure it and break the goals down into step-by-step processes. This is something that's really hard, and it's something that we work on with all sorts of graphic organizers, and developing a timeline, taking steps to complete the goal, and assessing progress, and then adjusting the plan, right? We have to be able to adjust and be able to learn that sort of plan A, plan B thinking. Goal setting is certainly something that's done in the IEP process, and so it's great for students to be involved in that, be involved in writing a goal or writing their whole IEP, as they are growing. But also there's ways we can teach goal setting at home, even something like reading a book. It's a chapter book, or just like setting a goal of when it's going to be completed by, how much should we read per night, completing an art project, right? Planning a party, preparing a family meal. I mean, these are all sort of goals that we can practice naming and then breaking down. And even, writing thank you notes after something, right? You have a goal of thanking everyone after a holiday or after a party. So there's great opportunities that we can work on goal setting. Perseverance is such a critical skill. And it really has to do with understanding the importance of putting forth continued effort, being able to work towards goals until they're accomplished. It is important to be persisting to a point, right? So not trying the same thing over and over again, but sticking with it, and then also being flexible and adaptable. It certainly requires, accepting failure and learning from failure. And that means being given the dignity to experience failure, right? It develops through other people explicitly modeling grit, trying to model sort of what you've tried and it didn't work and now you're trying another thing. And even modeling, I'm really, really frustrated about this, but, I'm taking a deep breath and then I'm gonna, think about what else I can try, right? Practicing things with support and then practicing without support. Someone may have to help make logical connections between actions and motivators, and why things are, why you're working so hard on something. It does involve believing you can achieve success. And so sometimes we do have to scaffold to create many successes for kids so that they can have that win, have that sense of efficacy, and be able to persevere with, slightly longer, slightly harder tasks. And it certainly requires risk taking. And so if we create IEPs that way over accommodate students, or if we as parents are just constantly knocking down barriers, or enabling students to avoid taking risks and avoid failure, we're preventing students from learning perseverance. And that means that we're sort of delaying students being able to be independent. And then sometimes, it's just a really critical skill that we have to be conscious of and be supporting. Use of available resources has to do with the presence and use of effective support systems. And so it requires, knowing that you need help, but also knowing what help is available and being able to ask for the right kind of help. And sort of help that's available in high school or help that's available at home is different than help that's available in other settings. And we need to directly and explicitly teach about kind of what kinds of help you have. Having access to a counselor in the moment at school is different than how you access mental health or coping support post-high school life. And so you need to understand that. There are some resources we can access for help 24/7. There's others that are time limited. For let's say a student who's transitioning off to college, some of the available resources might be, friends, right? Or being able to successfully participate in small groups to complete projects and sort of use the small group as a support, being able to successfully participate in community organizations such as a club sport or a social group, right? And just having successful interactions with peers and teachers and other support people on campuses. So there's ways that the student needs to build skills to be able to use all those resources. Certainly using available resources builds upon your self-awareness and your self-advocacy skills and your knowledge of those community resources. Coping strategies are very important and sort of connected with that perseverance, right? Students need to develop effective means of reducing and coping with stress and frustration and other emotional aspects of having a neurodiverse profile, and then also just adulting, right? And just like goal setting, coping strategies develop when students are allowed to take risks, but also with explicit social emotional learning. Something that is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine is when students have annual goals or private counseling and only work on using coping skill strategies within a specific setting or with a specific person. The thing about coping is you have to be able to cope in real time with real life stressors. And so we always need to work on helping students generalize whatever coping skills and strategies they have to the environments where they're going to need to use them, right? And in the times when they're going to experience that stress. Students have to be able to recognize and anticipate emotional triggers, to recognize emotional buildup, right? To sort of like be able to implement something before it's too late. And to independently select and use coping strategy from a varied set of strategies. You know, it's very telling to me when I'm working with a young person and I ask what does help make you feel calm? And if a student can't come up with anything, right? Anything they're sort of doing, whether it's a exercise each day, or even if it's just calling my mom, whatever it is, students need to be able to sort of know some of the things that help reduce stress for them. And the last skill that I want to talk about is self-determination. But as I've mentioned, this is one of the most important skills, if not the most important skill, and it builds from and incorporates many of the other described skills. So this slide includes two definitions of self-determination that both come from fact sheets that were put together by the Division on Career Development and Transition from the Council for Exceptional Children. The first is the most current. It says the ability to make choices, solve problems, set goals, evaluate options, and take initiative to reach one's goals and accept the consequences of one's actions. But I also really like the second definition, which just says being able to make choices and decisions about one's own life without any more support than necessary. And that's certainly different for each person. And we should never assume that being self-determined means being like fully independent, right? It means being interdependent. It means using support, just not using more support than is needed. Individuals with higher levels of self-determination have better, more positive adult outcomes, have better quality of life, and actually have more positive school experiences. So the more a student feels like they're able to make choices, that they're sort of involved in picking their classes, involved in you know, picking out their activities on a daily basis, being able to speak up for themselves, we see higher grades, better attendance, fewer behavior issues. You know, students who feel in control of some portion of their lives are having more positive outcomes and also just having more positive experiences in school. Self-determination certainly develops with frequent opportunities to make choices, engage in problem solving, and set goals. And you know, certainly you can set limited choices for young people, but giving choices and or you know, taking a minute to work with a student to try to think of how to solve a problem as opposed to solving it for them, giving opportunity to set goals instead of us setting the goals. All of these things help to develop self-determination. And certainly active involvement in the IEP development and implementation is something we know predicts success. I do also want to mention that employment is a predictor of success in college and adult life. So it's not coming out of the same research studies that I've been mentioning, but there is tons of research backing this, that students who have paid work as high school students are more likely to be successful college students. Also, students who have paid work as high school students are more likely to have paid work in adult life. And we are living in this wonderfully unique time where there is such an enormous demand for unskilled workers and for quirky workers and for, you know, like, it's much harder to get fired right now. So students have more of an opportunity to have efficacy with employment. You know, the challenge around employment for a lot of the young people I'm working with right now is that there is some self-advocacy required in making sure that you're getting to end your shift when you're supposed to end your shift, or making sure that you're not getting assigned too many work shifts per week. But we're really living in an exciting time for students to be able to shift, you know, make a shift in paid employment in high school for all of our students with sort of range of abilities, and that's exciting. Soft skills certainly also matter, right? Initiative and work ethic and professionalism. And so we need to be directly teaching some of these soft skills in addition to the other variables I've mentioned. And I know I've shared a lot of strategies along the way. There's just a few other points that I would like to make as far as thinking about transition planning and what makes a difference. You know, certainly the vision drives everything. The more that we can create a narrative of expectation and possibility, the more that we keep looking back to what we're trying to achieve with young people, and also being willing to allow goals and vision to change, and making it the student's vision and not just our vision as parents. And keeping it very, very strength-based, or parents or educators, and keeping it very strength-based. Like, I don't know, I was going to be an opera singer at one point. When I applied to college, I was going to be a computer science major, and here I am, a transition specialist, which is a job that did not exist at the point in time when I was in school. But certainly, there wasn't, people saying like, those are unrealistic things, right? We really need to think about how to empower students to set their own goals. And even when we may be skeptical, again, to sort of set those, like, let's start with the basic activities that are going to help the student progress toward the goals, and let's keep the student motivated. And then putting those testing opportunities for sort of trying out some of the things that may or may not be realistic, or may or may not be the best fit for their strengths and challenges. This is just a slide that sort of offers a way to break out visioning for young people. Where I'd like to live is sometimes the easiest or hardest question. If a student doesn't know where they want to live, you could talk about like, well, are you going to live in your parents' basement or attic? Are your parents going to let you live there? Where in the country do you want to live? Like, any one of these questions, where I want to live, or relationships I want to have. What am I going to do for fun? For some students, building leisure skills is such a key aspect of planning. And it can't just be leisure activities that only are with other students with disabilities, right? We need to find ways to be part of a broader community, no matter where the student's in school, or how a student interacts with the community. Where and how I'm going to learn, that could be classes or training or college or grad school, or, art, adult ed kinds of things. How am I going to get around? If you can't get there, you cannot have it, so transportation has to be a big piece of this, thinking about how a student's going to be transported, and work I want to have. And no matter what level of support the government is going to provide for a young person in adult life, there are a lot of basic skills that do have to be developed to be able to utilize that support. This is just a little bit more around IEP participation, something we can certainly start at home, helping students to understand that there are these meetings and what they're about, starting students to build some of the self-awareness that they need to be able to, again, name a disability category, know what their goals are, know what kinds of accommodations work with them. Certainly, I think school personnel have sort of varying familiarity with this level of participation. I often see within the same district, there may be students who are very involved in their IEPs and other students who are not. And so, different IEP teams may be more or less familiar with this, but it's something we really all, professionals and parents, need to be working towards, is really empowering students to be driving the IEP process. And if anybody's seen sort of new version or new draft of the IEP that we will be implementing in Massachusetts over the next couple of years, there was a huge intention for the IEP to be student focused, student voice. There's a section right at the beginning that says, my disability is, I have other disability, right? The second part of the verbiage isn't accurate, but it says my disability is for where the category goes. And so we are all going to need to be working towards students, and we should have already, but certainly with this next IEP, really working towards making sure that we've taught students to be able to be part of this process. This is a graduated method for student-directed IEP, right? So just reviewing with students what the rights are and what the IEP process is, having a student be present for a meeting, reviewing the IEP, the student reviewing their IEP with a parent or professional, preparing a script to be able to talk at the team meeting, or presenting a PowerPoint presentation or brochure. I love to see students be involved in writing and reporting for a specific goal or multiple goals. And certainly by the time students are exiting, we want them to be able to be an IEP facilitator. It's their meeting. There are some, I should say, sometimes there's times that a student can't be part of a team, of the actual team meeting. And so you might find it helpful to have them meet with some team members, ideally before, not just after, but some students, they like to just get the rundown after, which at least is still before an IEP is finalized. I also think we really need to think about what our team dynamics are so that we are creating safe spaces for students to be part of team meetings. And if that's not the case, the team has work to do, and that's got to be done because the student has the right to be part of their IEP process from age 14 on in Massachusetts, and before if it's appropriate. This is just a resource from iamdetermined.org. It's just letter I, letter M, the word determined.org. They have some phenomenal resources for helping students to learn about IEPs. They have like a sample of an IEP that's kind of just more describes the sections. It's a little bit cleaner than the forms we have in the state. They have assessments that students can do, or this is a brochure that sort of asks the student how they would like to be part of their process. Again, every student can participate in different ways, and we need to be figuring out how best to enable that. I cannot emphasize enough minimizing accommodations across different environments. This is so hard when a team has worked really hard to put something like a one-to-one aid in place for a student, and it took a long time to figure out that that support was needed. And then I say, hey, guess what? A one-to-one support is not available anywhere after high school. You cannot get that level of support in other learning environments. You cannot get that level of support in a work setting. For any student who wants to be integrated meaningfully into community life post-high school, sort of a minimum would be to be able to function at a 1-to-4 or 1-to-5 ratio. Oftentimes, you end up being in more supported and less included environments if that's the level, if you need more support than that. And so we have to be thinking about how to reduce accommodations and have students meaningfully access without quite so many accommodations, and also having the accommodations be less human dependent, right? More technology or low technology, high technology related and less human related. And I would really encourage you to think about one thing you could do differently, removing a particular reminder, right? Removing a prompt, or not doing something that student already knows how to do, right? Just trying to think of a little something you could do differently to minimize some of the ways that we're accommodating at home and help really facilitate independence. And I know it takes a lot of time to do this. So, if today's not the day, make it tomorrow, but just try. As I mentioned, automaticity is huge. The ability to do things without occupying the mind and the low level details required, and allowing it to become an automatic response, right? We want things like, I always go to laundry, right? You want that to be automatic, right? You want finding the help desk in a store to be automatic, finding a bathroom in a community place to be automatic. We don't want energy to go to those tasks when we need to be managing other things like working or shopping or, whatever sort of independent activity the student's trying to do. Certainly practicing generalization is critical. Not just doing something in your home or in a classroom, but doing it out in the community in real world environments. And I mentioned that I would talk about building a lasting team, and we really need to rethink what teams look like. We need to be building our young people into their communities, right? So you may find it useful to invite other people specifically to IEP team meetings, but you might have other kinds of team meetings as you start to build the team that's going to support a young person in adult life. So certainly parents and siblings can be important pieces of this process. Grandparents can be important pieces of the process, really close family friends or friends of the student, depending on who those friends are and how the student is, dating relationships, familiar staff, workers at local stores, right? Go through the same checkout line or go through a couple of checkout lines. Really take time to introduce and meet people in your community. I've often talked about students, if you're worried about safety in the community, by the time a student exits high school, you want them to be the mayor of the community. You want every single person to know who they are so that the community is sort of watching out for that individual. And that is possible. It takes time and it takes relationship building. And there's certainly a lot of other people on this list, faith community, other school personnel who aren't necessarily special education related, right? Other adult service providers need to be brought in as early as possible. Coaches, troop leaders, anybody who's shown interest in this young person or who you can build some interest up and could be part of a supportive team. Don't forget to plan ahead for transportation. If there's no sense of how a child's going to be able to get from point A to point B in an emergency, that needs to be a focus. And it can be a focus very early on. Travel training can be getting around to school independently, getting on transportation independently, getting across a parking lot independently, all the way up to things like using public transit or using paratransit services, safely and consistently. So transportation is huge. And then don't forget technology, and these can be really specialized technologies, but we also have a lot of more general technology that can be extremely helpful for young people. And I always try to think about anywhere that if I'm making a prompt, is there a way that we can adjust and have have the young person make a prompt? In our house, we have a lot of those like Google Home devices. And so when there's a deadline for something to be completed, we've taught the kids, it's like, hey, Google, set a timer for X amount of time, right? Now somebody may still want to play when they're done with that, and we're working on responding to the timers appropriately, but just trying to figure out how a young person can be doing more things without adult human support, without paid support, is really a critical piece of this process. These are some other examples of kinds of technologies that can be useful, GPS devices for like location-based reminders, something that you get reminded of every time you get to work or get to school. Speech to text and text to speech can be so critical for facilitating writing or communication kinds of things. Being able to text message, right? When you get somewhere, when you leave somewhere is also really important. And this is just the contact information for us at NESCA. I will say, I don't think I'm overselling it to say that we have a pretty phenomenal blog. We have a staff blog that all of our clinical team contribute to. And so you get pieces written by neuropsychologists and transition specialists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, educational consultants. And it comes out weekly on Mondays right now. And you can also go and search through previous blogs. And I often write a blog when I've had multiple questions come in from a family member, or when I've given a presentation like this and had a question that I thought I should write out. So I would encourage you to subscribe if you're interested in learning more. And I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'm sorry for taking a little more time than I had anticipated. I haven't seen anyone chat in a question while I was presenting. Which is either wildly positive or I've overwhelmed you. But if anybody wants to add some questions to the Q&A, be happy to answer some questions related to IEP transition planning or just more generally planning for adulthood.
We have one. Any suggestions for how to encourage someone who does not want to participate in transportation training?
I have never had that question before, and I feel like I need a little more information to think about this. So what I always think about is we have to start with figuring out what motivates this particular someone in general, right? So and this happens with students who we want to obtain a driver's license, but they have too much anxiety to drive, right? And so anxiety is an amazing motivator, and there has to be more motivation to drive than being anxious. So with transportation training, there has to be a place, right, that the young person is motivated to get to in order to help foster some of the motivation to take part in the travel training. It's interesting because, and it depends what kind of transit you're trying to work with the student around as well, right? I think some students initially think they don't want to be using paratransit services, but then once they have the experience of using the MBTA and having a bus or a train canceled and having to wait for an hour somewhere, they become more motivated to learn to use Uber or to learn to use paratransit. So again, the encouragement has to come with finding something that will motivate that individual. Sort of as specific, I guess I can be without more information.
And can a 12-year-old participate in an IEP meeting, or does it have to be at age 14?
I love that question. I have worked with young people ages 9 and 10 who've participated in an IEP meeting. And I really think we're going to need to work towards including students in IEP meetings. And the first IEP meeting that we need to include a student's voice in the state of Massachusetts is including the voice in the IEP that will be in place when the student turns 14. So that's actually oftentimes a 13-year-old. But yes, if a student is interested, if a parent is comfortable, which can be difficult, then like those are the variables, right? A parent can invite anyone to a team meeting they want to. It's polite to give the school notice, but if your 12-year-old's up for it, or your 11-year-old, or your 10-year-old, or your 9-year-old, start as early as you possibly can. That's completely appropriate. Obviously, warn your team and think about what the participation is going to look like. Do you want to ask the next question, Jane?
Sure. Any ideas of how to start introducing our 11-year-old nonverbal autistic son to participate in an IEP meeting?
Yeah, so if students are, and it's going to depend a lot on the young person, right? But when students are nonverbal, then we're thinking about, again, how to get their voice, how to get their interests into the team meeting. And so some of this comes down to how this student's able to communicate wants and needs in any environment, right? And so a lot of times with students who are nonverbal, we'll use a methodology called sort of a person-centered planning meeting. And there are a lot of like visually based person-centered planning models where we might have a pre-meeting outside of the team meeting with people who the student knows well and the student, and doing more like brainstorming as a group or getting feedback from a lot of people as a group to make sure that we have a good sense of, what makes the student like what are the leisure activities the student likes, what are the strengths, what are some of the things that are helpful, what are the coping skills. So some of it is working with people around the student or working with the student in a group and then figuring out how the student can communicate some of their interests, right? So, is it better to like build up a PowerPoint presentation and I don't know if this student has access to appropriate communication device, but that would be something I would also be thinking of. So there's a lot of ways to help the student getting ready for that. And if a student can't sit in the room, through that long of a meeting, I would always encourage figuring out how that student can do some sort of presenting at the beginning of the meeting. And you might even do, it could be a video you put together at home with the student kind of showing some of the things they're most interested in to the team, right? You can be really creative in terms of how to get the student's voice and presence into the team meeting.
And I think this pertains to one of the questions earlier, but this person's child does not want to do GATRA training because the mom is always around to do it. Any suggestions there?
I mean, again, it's motivation, right? And so I'm a parent, I get in my own way sometimes. And if I'm a parent who never tells my child, no, I'm not going to take you somewhere you want to go, then my kid's never going to want to take a different transportation method, right? Like that's a perfectly reasonable thing for a child to do. If I always make a sandwich for my kid, they're never going to want to make it for themselves. So that there has to be some collaboration with the family, right, in this particular interest. And parent could do the GATRA training with the student. Parent or school may have to create some other external motivators too, if we're having difficulty getting sort of buy-in, but there has to be collaboration on that one, and there has to be collaboration for any of these. And did see that for this student where we were talking about participating in the IEP meeting, that he does use an AAC device. And so that's great. You know, I would especially want to work with a speech language pathologist or with his special educator, you know, work with whoever is working with him with that device, you know, making sure that we've got the right, you know, sort of like the right graphics and the right options, the right, I'm like, my brain is freezing, but the right vocabulary loaded into the device so that this, you know, and that we're doing some pre-teaching using the device so that the student can be participating in their team meeting, right? So making sure that the student's ready to share some things that they like, some things they don't like, you know, if there are, you know, classes that you could anticipate a student might want to take based on previous positive experiences, you know, being able to share those things. So I think there would be a lot of collaborative pre-work to help the student have the right vocabulary and be able that they're going to be able to share some information. And then it is hard, right? Like time is a horrible factor in this process where we try to have IEP meetings very efficiently, and that can do a real disservice to a student who needs more time to process, more time to communicate. I mean, really, those are the biggest things, right? More time to process or more time to communicate. Those students can kind of get left in the dust at their IEP meetings. And so that's when we really need to be working with the team around a little bit of a cultural shift and maybe coming up with, you know, pre-meeting or some additional teaching post-meeting, and then certain activities that are covered during the meeting so that the students as involved as they, you know, as they possibly can be, and so that we don't skip over the student in the process.
And if a parent is starting off kind of on the later end of things, what's the most important place to start? Or is that based on the student themselves?
It goes back to that, like, just do something differently today, right? So if a student's on a later end of the process, that's okay. You know, this whole process was going to take a whole bunch of time anyways, but really thinking about any of those self-determination skills, you know, what are the choices that student's making on a daily basis? What are the opportunities for speaking up for self that student is engaging in on a daily basis? What does the student know about themselves and their needs? You know, it's a lot of those self-determination skills that we have to build first. Also, if it's, you know, later, but sort of post or pre the actual transition, making sure that things like transportation, adult human service agency support, that those things are well lined up. And even like that might be a time to think about getting a really comprehensive transition assessment if that hasn't been done yet, just to be able to maximize what's being done through the IEP process, because that is a time limited process. We're at 12:03. I don't know if there's a last question. Otherwise, we'll end for the day.
I don't see anything else coming in right now.
Great. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us this morning and being such good listeners and good question askers. I would certainly encourage you to check out the blog. We're doing another presentation that'll be quite similar next Tuesday night, but we do other webinars throughout the year as well here at NESCA.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.